Bethpage, Long Island. A cold morning in 1994. A work crew climbs a ladder outside a hangar that has stood since 1932. They are not there to repair anything. They are there to remove a sign. 6 letters, welded to the same steel this company once bent into fighter planes. Grumman. For 65 years, that name meant something specific in American military aviation. It meant an airplane that came home. Pilots in the Pacific called their Wildcats and Hellcats the Grumman Iron Works, not because they were elegant, but because they refused to break. It meant the machine that carried 3 astronauts down to the surface of the moon and back when failure was not survivable. It meant the F-14 Tomcat, swinging its wings over an aircraft carrier deck, the single most recognizable silhouette of the Cold War's final decades. None of that saved the sign. By the time that crew reached the top of the ladder, Grumman Corporation no longer existed as an independent company. It had been absorbed, not by a foreign rival, not by bankruptcy, but by Northrop, a competitor it had outbuilt and outlasted for decades. This is the story of how a company that never lost a war lost its own name. Not on a battlefield. In a boardroom after the battlefield itself had disappeared. The story begins in 1929, in the weeks after the American economy collapsed. Leroy Grumman was 34 years old. He had spent the previous decade as an engineer and test pilot at the Loaning Aeronautical Engineering Corporation, a naval aircraft manufacturer based in Manhattan. Loaning was profitable, established, and safe. Grumman left it anyway. When Loaning's parent company decided to move manufacturing operations to Pennsylvania, Grumman refused to go. Instead, he gathered 4 former Loaning colleagues, pooled a little over $32,000 in personal savings, and rented an old garage on Long Island that had once serviced automobiles. The timing was, by any rational measure, insane. Banks were failing. Aviation contracts were drying up. And Grumman was starting an airplane company from a converted car shop with 5 employees. What he had, instead of capital, was a very specific idea. Naval aircraft needed to fold their wings to fit on the elevators and in the hangar decks of aircraft carriers, a mechanical problem most manufacturers treated as an afterthought. Grumman treated it as the central engineering challenge of carrier aviation, and he solved it better than anyone else in the industry. His first Navy contract in 1930 was for a retractable landing gear system fitted to biplanes built by other manufacturers. It was not glamorous work. It was precise, mechanical, unglamorous work, and it built the company's reputation before it had ever built a complete airplane of its own. By 1931, that reputation earned Grumman its first fighter contract, the FF-1, a 2-seat biplane fighter for the Navy, the first American-designed aircraft with a retractable landing gear to reach production. It was heavier than its rivals. It was also nearly indestructible. That combination, not the fastest, not the lightest, but the airplane most likely to survive contact with reality, became the company's signature before anyone had coined a nickname for it. The nickname came later, from the men who flew Grumman aircraft into combat. They called the factory the Iron Works. It was not a compliment born of admiration for design elegance. It was a soldier's compliment, the plane that got hit and kept flying and brought its pilot home. Leroy Grumman had built a company on a single unglamorous conviction that in war, survivability was not a feature. It was the entire point. Within a decade, that conviction would be tested on a scale no one at the company could have imagined in 1929. By December 1941, the United States Navy's frontline carrier fighter was Grumman's F4F Wildcat. It was about to fly directly into the most lopsided air combat mismatch of the war. The Wildcat's opponent was the Mitsubishi A6M0, lighter, faster, and far more maneuverable in a turning dogfight. Early encounters in the Pacific were brutal. Marine and Navy pilots who tried to outturn a Zero in a Wildcat generally did not come home. But the Wildcat had 2 advantages the Zero did not: armor plating around the pilot and self-sealing fuel tanks. The Zero had neither. Japanese designers had sacrificed protection for weight and therefore for speed and range. A Wildcat could absorb hits that would turn a Zero into a fireball. Navy pilot John Thack exploited this difference directly. He developed a tactic: pairs of Wildcats crossing paths to give each other a firing angle on any Zero attacking from behind. A maneuver that became known as the Thack Weave. Combined with the airplane's durability, the tactic changed the arithmetic of the air war. By the time the Wildcat's production run ended, Navy and Marine pilots flying it were credited with roughly 1,006 confirmed aerial victories against 191 losses in air-to-air combat, a kill ratio near 5-to-1, achieved in an airplane that its own pilots considered technically inferior to its opponent. Grumman's answer to the Zero's speed advantage arrived in 1943, the F6F Hellcat. Designed with direct input from captured Zero airframes and combat reports from Wildcat pilots, the Hellcat kept the armor and the structural toughness the Navy had come to expect from Grumman, and added the power and speed the Wildcat had lacked. The results were immediate and overwhelming. Over the course of the war, Hellcat pilots were credited with over 5,200 aerial kills, more than any other Allied fighter in the Pacific theater, against a loss ratio of better than 19-to-1. In the Battle of the Philippine Sea, in June 1944, Hellcats were so dominant against Japanese carrier aircraft that American pilots nicknamed the engagement the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Grumman's third major wartime aircraft carried a different kind of weight. The TBF Avenger was a torpedo bomber, slow and heavy by fighter standards, tasked with the most dangerous job in carrier aviation, flying straight and level toward enemy ships while anti-aircraft fire filled the sky around it. At the Battle of Midway in June 1942, the Navy's first combat deployment of the Avenger ended with 5 of 6 aircraft shot down. It was a devastating debut, but the airplane survived its own worst day, was refined, and went on to sink more Japanese shipping tonnage than any other American aircraft of the war, including the battleship Musashi. By 1945, Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, a company that had started in a rented garage 16 years earlier, had built more airplanes for the United States Navy than any other manufacturer in the country. It was no longer a scrappy startup. It was the backbone of American naval air power in the Pacific, and its name was now permanently associated with a single idea: the airplane that came home. That reputation would carry the company through the coming peace and eventually off the surface of the earth entirely. The end of the war brought the problem every defense contractor fears most: peace. Navy orders collapsed almost overnight in 1945, and Grumman, like every other wartime aircraft manufacturer, faced a stark question of survival. The company's answer was to diversify into whatever it could build with the same aluminum forming skills that had produced fighter planes, canoes, truck bodies, and eventually a line of aluminum boats and delivery trucks that would keep the balance sheet alive through the leanest post-war years. But the core business held, because naval aviation itself was entering a new era, and Grumman moved into it early. The F-9F Panther, the company's first operational jet fighter, entered service in 1949 and became the Navy's primary jet fighter of the Korean War, flying the first jet-versus-jet kill credited to a Navy pilot. Through the 1950s and into Vietnam, Grumman's A-6 Intruder became one of the most valued strike aircraft in the American arsenal. A subsonic, all-weather attack bomber capable of finding and hitting a target at night, in bad weather, low to the ground, when faster and flashier aircraft could not. It was not glamorous. It was once again the Grumman formula. Less about speed, more about getting the job done and getting the crew home. That reputation for uncompromising reliability reached its highest possible expression in 1962, when NASA selected Grumman to design and build the Apollo lunar module, the spacecraft that would carry astronauts down to the surface of the moon and, critically, back up off it. There was no margin for the kind of failure that could be repaired with a maintenance crew. If the ascent engine failed to fire on the lunar surface, the astronauts would die there. Grumman engineers built a lander with a redundant, almost absurdly overbuilt ascent propulsion system, and on July 20, 1969, the lunar module Eagle set Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin down in the Sea of Tranquility. Every Apollo lunar module used across 6 successful landings performed exactly as required. Even Apollo 13, when its own service module suffered a catastrophic failure, was saved by the Grumman-built lunar module, repurposed on the fly as an emergency lifeboat for 3 astronauts, powering and sustaining them through the crippled return to Earth. It was, in engineering terms, the single greatest vindication of everything Leroy Grumman had built the company to believe in. Back in 1929, That survivability was not a secondary feature bolted onto a design. It was the design. By the early 1970s, Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, now renamed Grumman Aerospace Corporation, had done what almost no other aviation manufacturer of its generation had managed. It had built the aircraft that won the Pacific War, the jets that fought Korea and Vietnam, and the machine that had carried human beings to the moon and back alive. Its engineering credibility was, by any measure, at its absolute peak. The company's next airplane would become its most famous. It would also mark the beginning of the end. The story of the F-14 Tomcat begins with a failure that belonged to someone else. In the mid-1960s, the Pentagon tried to force the Navy and the Air Force to fly a single common fighter platform, the F-111. The Air Force version eventually found a role. The Naval version, the F-111B, built for carrier operations, did not. It was too heavy, its carrier landing characteristics were poor, and by 1968, the Navy had killed the program outright, after years and hundreds of millions of dollars invested in an airplane it would never operate. The Navy needed a genuine carrier-based air superiority fighter, and it needed one immediately. In 1969, it opened the VFX competition to replace the F-111B. Grumman won it. What Grumman built was, at the time, the most technically ambitious fighter ever put on a carrier deck. The F-14's signature feature was its variable sweep wing. Wings that could pivot forward for slow-speed carrier landings, needing less runway and better low-speed control, then sweep backward into a narrow, high-speed configuration for supersonic intercept. Paired with the AWG-9 radar and Phoenix long-range air-to-air missiles, the Tomcat could track multiple targets simultaneously and engage enemy aircraft from over 100 miles away, a capability no other fighter in the world possessed at the time. It was designed for one specific mission: stopping waves of Soviet bombers before they got within missile range of the American carrier fleet. The Tomcat entered fleet service in 1974, and it did something few fighter aircraft ever manage. It became a genuine cultural icon, independent of its military role. In 1986, the film Top Gun put the F-14 on movie screens worldwide, and the airplane became, for an entire generation, the visual definition of American air power. Navy recruiting numbers spiked. The Tomcat was no longer just a weapons platform, it was a symbol. For Grumman, the F-14 represented the summit of everything the company had built since 1929, from a converted garage, to the airplane that beat the zero, to the machine that landed on the moon, to now, the most advanced, most famous fighter aircraft on Earth, built by a company that still bore its founder's name on every airframe. It would also be the last airplane Grumman ever designed from a position of complete strength. Because even as the Tomcat entered the culture as an unstoppable symbol, the company's next major program was already heading toward a financial reckoning that would prove far harder to survive than any wartime mission. In the 1980s, the Navy went looking for a stealth attack aircraft to replace its aging A-6 Intruder, the same subsonic workhorse Grumman had built decades earlier. The program was called the A-12 Avenger II, and this time Grumman did not build it alone. It partnered with McDonnell Douglas in a team arrangement, splitting design and manufacturing responsibility on an aircraft unlike anything either company had attempted: a flying wing, low observable bomber, nicknamed internally the Flying Dorito for its distinctive triangular shape. The program went wrong almost immediately, in ways that stayed hidden from the Pentagon's own leadership for years. Engineering problems compounded. Weight estimates crept upward past what the airframe could structurally support. Costs, originally projected around $4 to $5 billion for full development, spiraled toward figures the contractors themselves could not fully account for, and internal program managers reportedly concealed the scale of the overruns from Navy oversight rather than report them upward. By late 1990, the truth was no longer containable. The airplane was, by some estimates, roughly a year and a half behind schedule and well over $1 billion over budget, with no clear date for a working prototype. On January 7, 1991, Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney terminated the A-12 program outright. Not a delay, not a restructuring, a full cancellation. At the time, it stood as the largest weapons program cancellation in the history of the Department of Defense. The termination triggered a legal fight that would outlast the airplane itself by decades. The The Pentagon demanded the contractors repay roughly $1.35 billion in progress payments already disbursed for an aircraft that would never fly. Grumman and McDonnell. Douglas argued the cancellation was a termination for convenience, rather than a termination for default, a legal distinction worth well over $1 billion, since a default termination meant the government could claw the money back. The two companies fought the government over that distinction in federal court for more than 20 years, a dispute that was not fully resolved until 2014, long after Grumman itself had ceased to exist as an independent company. For Grumman specifically, the immediate financial damage in 1991 was severe. The company had poured engineering resources, factory capacity, and capital into a program that produced no aircraft, no revenue, and a contested debt obligation worth hundreds of millions of dollars on its own balance sheet. The A-12 disaster did not bankrupt Grumman outright, but it opened a financial wound at the worst possible moment, just as the entire defense industry around it was about to change in ways that would make that wound impossible to fully close. The Cold War, the company had spent 60 years preparing to fight, was about to end. And with it would go the one thing Grumman's business model had always assumed it would have: enough Pentagon contracts to go around. In late 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. For the American defense industry, this was not simply a geopolitical event. It was an extinction-level threat to the business itself. Pentagon procurement budgets, built for 4 decades around the assumption of permanent confrontation with the Soviet military, began falling almost immediately. Defense spending as a share of the federal budget dropped sharply through the early 1990s, and with it went the flow of contracts that dozens of aerospace and defense companies had structured their entire operations around. Analysts and Pentagon officials started calling it, without much affection, the peace dividend, a phrase that meant, for the industry, simply this: there was no longer enough work to keep every existing contractor alive. The Pentagon's own leadership understood the arithmetic before most of the companies did. In 1993, Secretary of Defense Les Aspin summoned the chief executives of the country's largest defense contractors to a dinner at the Pentagon. The meeting became known almost immediately as the Last Supper. The message delivered that night was blunt and unambiguous. The government could no longer support this many independent defense contractors on a shrinking budget. Consolidation was coming whether the industry wanted it or not, and companies that failed to merge should expect to eventually fail outright. It was, in effect, the federal government instructing its own supplier base to shrink itself. The wave that followed reshaped the entire industry within a few years. Lockheed merged with Martin Marietta to form Lockheed Martin. Northrop had already acquired Vaught's aircraft division. Boeing would go on to absorb McDonnell Douglas, the same company Grumman had partnered with on the failed A-12. In 1997, one after another, the great independent names of American defense manufacturing were folding into a handful of surviving giants. Grumman, still recovering from the financial damage of the A-12 cancellation, was exposed. It was a mid-sized, historically independent, family-founded company in an industry where independent and mid-sized had just become synonyms for acquisition target. In 1994, Martin Marietta, freshly merged and looking to expand further, launched a hostile takeover attempt for Grumman outright. Grumman's board fought it off, but the fight did not change the underlying math. The peace dividend was not going to reverse itself. The Pentagon was not going to fund enough new programs to sustain every legacy contractor, and Grumman's own leadership understood by 1994 that remaining permanently independent was no longer a realistic option. The only real decision left was who would be doing the acquiring, and on what terms. The answer to that question would come from a company Grumman had spent decades treating as a competitor, not a parent. In April 1994, Grumman's board reached an agreement, not with Martin Marietta, the company that had tried to take it by force, but with Northrop Corporation, which made a competing friendly offer of approximately $2.1 billion. The board accepted it as the better outcome available, a negotiated merger rather than a hostile seizure, and a partner whose own business, Northrop's B-2 stealth bomber program among its core assets, did not directly overlap with Grumman's naval aircraft work in a way that would gut the combined workforce entirely. There was a particular irony embedded in the choice of partner. Northrop and Grumman had competed directly against each other for Navy and Air Force contracts for decades, two of the industry's oldest rivals, dating back to the same interwar generation of aircraft companies. Now one was absorbing the other, and the surviving name on the letterhead would be Northrop's, not Grumman's. The deal closed in May 1994, and Northrop Grumman Corporation came into existence as a single company. For the roughly 19,000 employees still working at Grumman's historic Bethpage, Long Island facility, the same site the company had operated from since the years immediately following its 1929 founding, the merger was not an abstract financial event. It meant consolidation of duplicate functions, facility closures, and layoffs at a plant that had been the physical heart of the company for 65 years. Bethpage had built the airplanes that fought the Pacific War. It had built the lunar module that saved Apollo 13. Now it was one facility inside a much larger corporate structure, competing internally for whatever work remained. The government had gotten the consolidation it asked for at the Last Supper. The industry had gotten a survivable path forward on paper. And Grumman, a company that had never lost a war, never failed a mission that mattered, and had spent 65 years building some of the most trusted aircraft in American military history, had gotten absorbed by the company it used to beat for contracts. The name did not disappear immediately. It would survive for a few more years, hyphenated onto Northrop's, present on letterhead and press releases. But the company Leroy Grumman had founded in a rented garage, the independent entity that had answered only to its own board and the United States Navy, no longer existed. What remained was a division, a legacy business unit, a brand, folded into someone else's balance sheet. The sign outside Bethpage was still standing in 1994. It would not stand for very much longer. The years after the merger were, in operational terms, unremarkable, which was itself the point. Northrop Grumman did not shut Bethpage down overnight, and it did not immediately erase the Grumman name from the aircraft still flying. The F-14 Tomcat continued its service with the U.S. Navy under the new corporate banner, still built on Grumman engineering, still flying off carrier decks it had defined for 2 decades. To the pilots in the cockpit and the sailors on the flight deck, very little had changed. The airplane did not know its manufacturer had stopped being independent, but the corporate consolidation the merger began did not stop in 1994. Over the following years, Northrop Grumman steadily reduced its footprint on Long Island, shifting production, engineering work, and eventually entire business lines to other facilities across the country. Bethpage, once a sprawling complex that had employed tens of thousands of workers at its wartime peak, shrank year over year. Its runway eventually closed, large sections of the historic plant sold off or redeveloped for non-aerospace use. The physical place where Leroy Grumman's company had built the Wildcat, the Hellcat, and the lunar module was, piece by piece, ceasing to be an aerospace facility at all. The F-14 itself reached the end of its service life in 2006, retired by the Navy after 32 years of frontline duty, the last of the great Grumman-designed fighters to leave active service, closing out the era the Tomcat had come to symbolize on movie screens 2 decades earlier. By then, the sign outside Bethpage was already long gone, along with most of the workforce that had once built the airplane under it. What remained was the name itself, still legally present in Northrop Grumman Corporation, but functioning now as a brand asset rather than an independent company with its own board, its own factories, and its own identity. The company that Leroy Grumman built to survive the Great Depression had, in the end, been unable to survive the peace that followed the Cold War. It had spent 60 years preparing to fight. The final chapter of this story is not about what was lost. It is about what, quietly, still remains. Northrop Grumman Corporation, the company that absorbed Grumman's name in 1994, is today one of the largest defense contractors on Earth, building the B-21 Raider stealth bomber, the James Webb Space Telescope, and a substantial share of America's unmanned aircraft systems. None of that work carries the Grumman name in any prominent way, but a direct engineering line runs from Leroy Grumman's original conviction that survivability is not a feature bolted onto a design, but the design itself, through the lunar module that saved 3 astronauts, through the F-14 that defined naval air power for a generation, into the systems the merged company builds now. The philosophy outlived the letterhead. It is worth being honest about what Grumman got right and what it did not survive. The company was never wrong about engineering. The Wildcat, undergunned and outmaneuvered, still beat the zero on survivability. The lunar module, built with no room for failure, never failed. The A6 found its targets in weather that grounded faster aircraft. Grumman's founding bet, that the airplane which comes home matters more than the airplane that looks best on paper, was validated repeatedly in combat for 65 years. What the company could not survive was not a design flaw. It was a piece it had helped win. The end of the Cold War removed the very demand that had sustained Grumman's business model since 1929, and no amount of engineering excellence could manufacture a threat that no longer existed. There is a natural comparison worth drawing here, and it runs the opposite direction of most stories in this format. Grumman was not destroyed by a rival with a personal grudge, or a corrupt official, or a fraudulent competitor. It was destroyed by success, the successful conclusion of the very conflict it had spent 6 decades preparing to fight. Northrop, the company that absorbed it, was not an enemy in any traditional sense. It was simply the surviving structure in an industry the Pentagon itself had ordered to shrink. The sign came down in Bethpage in 1994. The engineering did not come down with it. They took the name. They could not take what the name had built.